Good morning, everybody. I'm Jess Bowie, co-editor of Civil Service World, and welcome to this CSW webinar. The theme of today's discussion is what might happen after the election and what the civil service can expect from a new administration. I'm very lucky to be joined today by four experts who will share their experience and insights on this fascinating topic. They are Alex Thomas, Programme Director at the Institute for Government and former senior civil servant, Jonathan Slater, former Permanent Secretary at the Department for Education and visiting professor at King's College London, Susanna Bracknell, seasoned Whitehall watcher and my co-editor at Civil Service World, and Kavian Brown, partner at Baringa's Government and Public Sector team. Baringa are also the sponsors for this event, so thank you, Baringa, for enabling us to come together this morning. I'd like to start the conversation by asking our panel to introduce themselves properly. Firstly, Alex, can you tell us a bit more about your work and your background?
Hi, Jess. Thank you, and thanks for having me. As I said, my name's Alex Thomas. I am a Programme Director at the Institute for Government, which, for those who don't know, is a non-partisan think tank that works on making government more effective, so the sort of how rather than the what of government. I lead our work on the civil service and policy making, so looking at all matters to do with how effective the civil service is and how things are going. I have been at the IFG for just over 4 years. Before that, I was a civil servant, as you said. I spent time in DEFRA, in the Department of Health, and in the Cabinet Office.
Great, thank you very much. I'll turn to you next, Jonathan. Could you give us a potted history of your career so far?
Yep, can do. Delighted to be here. So my dad was a teacher, my mum was a social worker, and many, many years later, I ended up as the permanent secretary of the department that oversees teaching and social work. What a coincidence. Maybe not. Maybe something about my upbringing meant that I was interested in the subject. Certainly didn't have the skills to be a teacher or a social worker myself. Those jobs are really hard. But I was sort of interested in administration. I didn't think I was clever enough to join the civil service. I thought that was for sort of people who went to Oxford. So I ended up in local government, spent 10 years in local government, but then rather by accident ended up in the civil service, did a variety of jobs, tremendous opportunities. It's a wonderful place, the civil service, to try new things. And as I say, ended up at the Department for Education until Boris Johnson decided it was a time for new official leadership at the department, so that nobody would be under any misapprehension that he meant political leadership. How could he, since the Secretary of State at the time was Gavin Williamson. Delighted to be here today.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Susanna, how long have you been reporting on Whitehall?
It's just, I've been reporting on Whitehall for 14 years. I'm interested that makes me seasoned. I was trying to work out how many more years I have to go before I become a veteran Whitehall reporter. And so, 14 years. I joined Civil Service World June 2010, so reporting on kind of really the interesting point where the last big transition we had after an election. So I'm quite looking forward to being able to kind of watch a big transition go through and report on it from day one rather than 2 months down the line.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Kavian, you started your career as a civil servant, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct, Jess. I spent the first 5 years of my career in the civil service, first at the Office for National Statistics, where I helped to write the 2011 census. Then I moved into central government at DCLG as a policy advisor, before moving into Cabinet Office, where I had my last few roles as a policy advisor, a project director, a bill manager, did a little bit of time in private office as well. But for the last 12 years, I've been a consultant, predominantly in central government and also into law enforcement. And I now lead Baringa's public sector strategy work and our work across police and justice. It's great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you very much. So we have a loose agenda for the discussion today, or a list of talking points, but we'd like it to be a free-flowing conversation, and we're going to make lots of time for questions at the end. And you should see on your screen a Q&A where you can type in your questions, and you can also give questions from other attendees the thumbs up. So if there's something that you would like to see answered that somebody else has already asked, please give them the thumbs up, and we will keep an eye on that for the Q&A section. Right, so let's dive in. To kick off the discussion, perhaps we could talk a little bit about the potential impact of different electoral outcomes, such as a coalition or a hung parliament, on the civil service. I'm going to come to Susanna first on this, and then I'm going to open it up. But I'm also going to politely suggest that we don't dwell too long on that because, and this could be a case of famous last words, but given Labour's massive lead in the polls and how consistent that lead has been for such a long time, I think it's worth devoting most of this conversation to what a majority Labour government could mean for the civil service. So, Susanna, just briefly talk us through some different electoral outcomes and what they could mean for officials.
Jess. So normally when I'm asked this question, it's for a non-civil service audience, and I begin with a long spiel about political impartiality and how the colour of the incoming government doesn't matter. But I'll skip that spiel and go straight to thinking about the other way I look at it is under what circumstances, under what conditions do civil servants feel they can do their best work and work most effectively. And I always say, we always hear from civil servants, they need clear political direction, they need a bit of stability, and around that political direction, they ideally need a kind of wider, as far as possible, political consensus. So you want direction from your minister that isn't immediately being undermined by another minister in the cabinet who's got a different direction they want to take your colleagues over there in. So if we think about clear direction, stability, consensus, you kind of assume the kind of most positive outcome for a civil service overall is going to be a majority government, which is going to stay in place for a number of years and be within itself quite united. Hopefully it's got a big enough majority and a strong enough leader that they are able to govern in that collective consensual way that our system is supposed to work like. So that's the one that I kind of think people assume is going to be the good one. Obviously a hung parliament creates more uncertainty. Is there going to be an election? If they've got a slim majority even, then you're going to have a government that's looking at parliament, looking at its party and not giving that political direction and leadership that the civil service wants. But I also think, from speaking to civil servants, as I say, I joined in 2010. So I kind of was learning about the civil service at the time while the civil service was relearning about coalitions. And when you speak to civil servants now, they always talk about that era as actually something of a golden time, a good time when you did have stability, you had a clear direction through the programme for government, you had proper processes around where there's division between two ministers or two policies, there's a proper process to get those details up to the Quad or wherever else at the top of government, resolve those differences, come up with an answer and go forward with it. So actually a coalition government can be quite positive for the civil service as well. And I guess I don't know, I know we're seeing all the polls saying strongly Labour, but I think the mood in the country is so kind of tired and disheartened that things like a turnout on the day, things like voters feeling actually they're comfortable to vote for protest votes, and then more people vote for a protest party than they had told the pollsters they would. Absolutely think we should kind of focus a lot on what's going to happen if we have a Labour majority, but I don't think we should rule out other options, a smaller majority than they might be thinking, maybe some kind of a coalition or agreement going in place. And maybe I'm saying that just to keep my life interesting for the next few months.
So I've just put £10 on a hung parliament. Thank you, Suze. Unless anyone is desperate to come in on different electoral outcomes, Alex, a little bit from Alex. No problem, go for it.
Tiny point. Sorry, Jess, to be undisciplined already, but it was just to add to what Susanna was just saying, which is that while I completely agree both that a Labour majority government seems at the moment most likely, and that it's the most interesting thing for us to talk about today because it's the most change, and if we're interested in transitions, that's the relevant subject. I do think I'll put a sort of little marker down, which is I'm not sure how helpful it is for the civil service itself to be thinking too much into, it will be a Labour government or it won't be a Conservative government, partly because I'm very conscious of the long tail that could, or the long shadow that could be cast on the Conservative Party and Conservative ministers if they think that at this point the civil service is sort of already switching to thinking about a Labour government. So while I think in this sort of privileged forum, and we're all lucky enough to be able to talk and speculate on a Labour government, I think there is something about the civil service, genuinely kind of holding itself back both for the kind of psychological discipline of doing that, and because it could have cast a really long shadow on, one of the main political parties in the country that would be damaging for the civil services kind of long-term reputation. And I think the same goes for, when it seemed unlikely that Jeremy Corbyn's Labour was going to win in 2017, turned out not to be that unlikely, and B, the reputation of the civil service. It was really important that the civil service took those access talks seriously, whatever the polls said, for their long-term reputation with the Labour Party. So sorry, but that was my little addendum.
That is a really important point. Thank you for making it. Jonathan, I think you wanted to come in.
Agree with everything that Susanna and Alex have said. Two very small additional points. A small number of people, as you would have expected, at senior levels were doing some planning for the 2010 election. Recognising Alex's point that for 99% of people, they were getting on with their jobs. And none of the people who were doing the work in 29 came up with the right answer. So it's really difficult to predict what's going to happen. I mean, none of us were ready for the coalition that we got. I mean, as you say, Susanna, it went pretty well, but that's worth bearing in mind. You normally get it, you often get it wrong. So that's another reason not to make an assumption about what it's going to be. And then speaking personally, in 2009, I was working in the Ministry of Justice. Suma Chakrabarti was my boss. He had a very explicit agreement with Jack Straw, who was the Secretary of State, that he was going to focus as many of the resources of the ministry as delivering for the current government in precisely the way that Alex said. But because Jack was an experienced politician who understood that one of the jobs of the civil service was to prepare for the next lot, he just had an open conversation with Jack about a team of people, happened to be led by me, who were going to prepare for the next lot. And, Jack was happy with that. Some Secretary of State were not, but Jack was. So, you've got to do this stuff openly and straightforwardly. And if Jack had said no, then we wouldn't have done it because he was our boss. But he was mature and said yes. He did say, by the way, if we came up with any great ideas for the next lot that he could pinch, he'd like the opportunity to do so. And he did. And that was fine.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, well, all of that notwithstanding, and those are excellent points, and no one has a crystal ball, but just for the sake of hypothesis, let's assume that Labour does form the next government and does so with a majority. How would the civil service need to adapt to a new administration, and what would it mean for the workforce and its capability? Jonathan, I'm going to come to you first. Presumably the big question for officials is, how do you cope when your new bosses haven't been in power for either 14 years or in most cases have never been in power? How does that work?
Generally, without wishing to press anybody, not very well. You would think that the whole point of a permanent civil service is for this moment. They come and go. We're around forever. We manage the transition. Actually, and sometimes it works fine, but we shouldn't assume it will basically be fine, because when you look historically, often it isn't. Blunders of Our Government is a book which should be compulsory reading for everyone in this call. And one of its conclusions is that some of the biggest blunders are made precisely when there is a change of government. And that's because, as you say, Jess, the politicians in charge have never been in charge, so they're completely new. They've spent quite a lot of time thinking about what they would like to do, but without the benefit of any advice from any of us, because that's how the system works. And they're very enthusiastic. And how likely are we to say, I'm afraid that's an extremely poor idea, to people we've never met before? We're trying to build trust. We're trying to get them to feel like we're on their side. We're a little bit nervous. They might think we've been spending so long working for the other side that they might not be that keen on our advice. And so we lean in, try and be as helpful as possible. Before you know it, you've engaged in a comprehensive restructuring of the NHS, which is a total disaster, to take one example. And when I spoke to more experienced permanent secretaries, I wasn't one in 2010, and said, why are we finding this so hard? One of them said to me, actually, Jonathan, it doesn't happen very often, right? It happens like every 10, 15, 20 years. So most people get one of these. So why should we expect to be any good? So as I say, I'm not saying this to depress anybody. I'm saying, therefore, we need to be on alert. We need, clearly, it is our job. I say our job, your job, to as civil servants, to build the confidence and trust of your new political bosses. Of course it is. And you should be trying to lean in to encourage them to see you as people who know what you're talking about. But at the same time, do guard against not offering your objective advice. It is your job. It is in the law, and this is the time when it's needed most of all. And bear in mind that, I don't know Keir Starmer or Rachel Reeves or any of these people, but they seem, don't they, reasonably intelligent, thoughtful people who you could imagine having a conversation with. That's been true of most of the secretaries of state I've worked for. Not all of them, but most of them. So take the most of that opportunity and don't hold back. Because you'll soon find if you do, it's too late.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Alex, I'm going to come to you next. I asked Alex before we were live, whether he had any sort of thick of it moments from transition periods or any colourful anecdotes. So if you've thought of any, Alex, let us know. But also, could you talk about sort of that willingness to please versus not overseeing any kind of elephant traps or blunders, or that balance that officials have to strike?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I agree with everything Jonathan said. I was racking my brains for hilarious anecdotes, and all the ones I came up with were quite depressing. So I'll share those in a minute. But I'll try and not go too far down the kind of downbeat theme, as Jonathan was saying. On the serious point, it is. I completely agree with everything Jonathan said about that kind of desire to please, and that comes from a good place. It is really important that you develop a trusted and confident relationship with a new Secretary of State or a new set of ministers, and that you don't position yourself at whatever kind of level you are or role you have in the organisation as a kind of naysayer or a cynic or someone who's kind of going to be downbeat. But at the same time, and this is, it's easy to say, hard to do, as they say, but at the same time, you also want to establish yourself as credible, and being credible doesn't always involve saying yes. It involves, exactly as Jonathan was saying, sometimes, no, or yes, but, or I hear your the outcome you want to achieve. Have you thought about achieving it in this way instead of that way? The classic example that we always go to, and it's a little bit unfair on some of the people involved, but because it's so kind of clear, is universal credit, because there was a kind of really clear time versus quality versus money kind of classic triangle there, where Ian Duncan Smith was pushing to go further, faster on universal credit at the same time as Gordon Brown, Freudian slip. George Osborne was saying, let's try and take money out of the benefit system because of austerity. Same time as the department was saying, well, hang on, there's this huge thing that is going to be fundamental to our way of doing business. We think it will take a bit longer to do than Ian Duncan Smith does, and you end up with that kind of clash. In the end, if a Secretary of State insists on something, of course the department falls into line. But one of the things that I would say to Labour people is, to incoming Labour ministers, is that it's really important that you send a signal that you want honest advice. You won't be a patsy, you won't be taken for a ride by the civil service. You'll challenge estimates of cost and time and so on. But you want to go out of your way to encourage that honest advice. So it's on the civil servants, but it's also on those incoming ministers as well to make that plain. One thing I think, and I'll get onto the sort of dodgy anecdotes in a minute, but the one thing I think is overlooked a little bit in this potential transition is there is already a bit of ministerial experience around that shadow cabinet table. People sometimes focus on one or two figures, but I'm bound to get this wrong, but I was just scribbling down names. I think there are 5 shadow cabinet ministers who seem fairly likely to be in government, who are kind of already in the shadow cabinet, which is Hilary Benn, Ed Miliband, Pat McFadden, Yvette Cooper, and John Healey. So that I don't want to overplay that, because a lot of ministers and potential junior ministers won't have had government experience, and also the civil service and government has changed quite a lot in the last 14 years, and a lot of things are different now that weren't the case in 2009 or 2010. But there is some experience around that table, and so kind of leaning into that, I think, is good. On the stories, and I said they were all a little bit depressing, and to Jonathan's point, it's quite rare that you get an actual transition of government. We got very used to transitions of prime minister, but a party-to-party transition of government is pretty rare. The one that obviously came to mind was 2009-2010, which was my personal experience. I was in DEFRA at the time, and then what became the Cabinet Office when Nick Clegg came in. So I moved jobs around the same time. But the main thing that it made me think of is that stuff has a tendency to happen around those elections. So with Gordon Brown coming into office in 2009, there was obviously the Glasgow terror attack. There was foot and mouth disease and animal diseases. There were floods. With the coalition coming in, there was the Greek financial crisis. With Theresa May, again, not a full government transition, but with Theresa May coming into actually the 2017 election, again, not a transition of prime minister, but a big political moment. The election was on the Thursday, and the Grenfell Tower catastrophe was on the early on the Tuesday morning. Around these big political moments, it's not unusual for big things to happen, and for the civil service to need to respond to that with sometimes quite green ministers, or ministers who are very distracted by all the other stuff that's going on. So to the extent there's kind of anecdotage, it was mostly in that kind of space. The one slightly lighter thing is, I do remember in the very early days of the coalition government, I was working on constitutional reform. Kavian came and we worked together for a bit after that, but I was working on constitutional and electoral reform, the AV referendum. So we had a lot to do with Nick Clegg in those very early days of the coalition. And I just remember this slightly kind of, bewildered figure sitting in a huge office that had been scrambled, wasn't expected to come in, been scrambled for him to occupy a kind of skeleton private office, one or two people. And I think that had quite a big impact on Clegg and how he thought about government and how the next 5 years went, which was that he was kind of underserviced at the start. So it's the small things, the nature of the private office, the quality of the sandwiches, those have a really outsized impression on ministers when they come into their jobs. And those are the stories that they will tell all their colleagues. So as well as those big kind of blunders of our government and making sure you don't fall into those traps, getting the small stuff right is of outsized importance. So yes, do sweat the small stuff, I think, in those early days.
Working out where everybody should sit was another one that was cited in the IFG's excellent podcast series on preparing for power. Kavian, I'm going to come to you next. You were a junior official in the Department for Communities and Local Government in 2010, weren't you? What were your memories of getting a Secretary of State from a different party?
Yeah, I was a grade 7 in the better regulation team at DCLG, and at the time of when the coalition came to power, I remember we went through that process of pre-election and purdah and preparing and all the excitement and anticipation that comes into that. And then there was, I don't know, maybe a 5 or 10 day period where all the negotiations were happening and nothing seemed to move. And then we were glued watching BBC News as they were announcing the Secretaries of State and the ministerial team for each department. And then the news came through that Eric Pickles is our Secretary of State. And we got an email from Peter Housden, the permanent secretary at the time, saying, everybody down to the entrance and to the atrium, because we're going to clap the minister in as he arrives. And an hour or so later, Eric Pickles arrives at the door, and we all stand in the atrium and clap him in, half expecting the big rousing speech. And to be fair to him, he probably didn't anticipate that there would be a few hundred officials standing waiting for him to give a speech, but he just very simply said, thank you, time to get on with it. And he got in the lift and went straight up to his ministerial office. And that kind of set the tone for us as a department, actually, and as a team of officials. We did go back to our desk and thought, right, it's the business. I was just thinking, Jonathan, Alex, about some of your points on why that first period can feel so difficult. And from the position that I was in, there are two reflections that I have on why is it that when we get a new Secretary of State, or we get that change of colour of government, things can feel that bit more frustrating on both sides. And I think the first thing to say is that the trade-offs that, Alex, you talked about, for example, with universal credit, those trade-offs, when you're working with an established ministerial team, as an official, you understand largely where your ministers are going to come from and where they're going to land on these trade-offs, not just the trade-offs between policy teams within the department, but actually when you look across government as well. That enables you to then, as an official, to get ahead of a lot of that and to put the briefing in and to manage those discussions and those negotiations as they're moving forward. When it's a brand new ministerial team, that basis of understanding, those years of experience that you have with your ministers, disappears. And then you get the frustration on both sides. You get the frustration from the officials because we can't quite get ahead of where we need to be. And you get the frustration from ministers who are saying, you're just not getting this. You're not really understanding. And the second thing that we felt really quite acutely, actually, is this need to generate ideas and to come forward with proposals on how we can move things forward. Jonathan, you talked about the ministers coming in with all of their ideas because they've spent the last few years engaging with academia and with think tanks and reflecting on what they want to do when they're in power. The civil service then does a really good job, notwithstanding the points on wanting to build relationships, does a really good job in saying, well, actually, that's not quite going to work in the way that we want it to work. And we have to start thinking about implementation in a different way. And that can be perceived from my experience as kind of, well, you're just blocking me now, aren't you? And if we're not going to be able to deliver it that way, tell me how I'm going to be able to deliver it. And that at times was challenging because we spent collectively as a department, the last 13 years working in a particular direction to a different government, and now we're heading in a different direction. So those 2 points on the kind of the corporate understanding of where your ministers are in those trade-offs, and then the need to be really proactive and come forward with ideas on how we're going to move things forward, were two of the big reflections I have from welcoming a new Secretary of State and a new ministerial team.
Thank you very much, Kavian. So thinking a bit beyond those first few days and weeks, which can be quite energizing for officials, of whatever the complexion of the new party coming into government, I want to ask you, Susanna, what are your thoughts on the impact that after the first 100 days, let's say, when officials and politicians move into a more business as usual mode, what could that feel like for civil servants?
So before I answer that, can I give a sweat the small stuff anecdote, which Jess and I heard from Peter Schofield when we interviewed him for our winter issue last year. He recalled doing a briefing for Alistair Darling in '97, and everyone was so nervous that one of the private office staff poured the coffee into the sugar bowl by mistake. And that, Peter's doing this briefing and he's realised what's happened, and Alistair's realised what happened, and Peter just thinks, right, I'm just going to carry on. I'm not going to try and do the impression. But Alistair apparently sort of looked up, and then said, I'll have to stop you. You're telling me how bad the financial situation is, but you don't need to. I can see it's so bad the Treasury can't even afford handles for its cups. They've got it in a sugar bowl without the handle. So yeah, so that, I don't know if we even have sugar bowls anymore in the civil service. Maybe they do in the Treasury, but don't put coffee in the sugar bowl. So yeah, thinking beyond the kind of first initial weeks of excitement, because I think that when I speak to people, when I've heard from Jonathan and others in the past, it is an exciting time, a time of transition. It is something that civil servants, you join the civil service to support government and the democratic process and to make a difference. And a time of transition, government to government or prime minister to prime minister, is an exciting moment when you feel like you're part of that democratic process and you've got new ideas coming in, new people. And also, I think there's this feeling at the moment, as in civil service in the wider country, everyone is waiting for this election. Everyone senses that something needs to change. We're kind of stuck in the mud a little bit. And so I think there's two kind of issues that come up when I speak to people in the civil service and reflect with them on what's going to happen going forward. There's one risk that people are so looking forward to change, so energized by that initial change. And of course, there is an incoming government, of whatever colour, with new ideas and new energy and hopefully a majority and some stability. But they're not going to come in with a whole load more money or a whole load more people for your immediate team. So civil servants who are tired of years of crisis and years of, really working hard will remain tired or will revert to that tired state, and there won't be a magic money tree. Starmer has said it's a reforming government, not a checkbook government. So how do you kind of, as a leader, pick your team up again who are so tired and exhausted already, and say to them, okay, we've really got to keep driving on this, even though that initial excitement has worn off and we still don't have money. And we've just got to, motivate people in a slightly different way, because the other issue that I've kind of heard people speaking about and reflected on with people is the civil service has got very good at responding to crises and thinking in that kind of short-term way. And we've had, as Alex said, a lot of transitions prime minister to prime minister. So civil servants are very good at briefing new ministers and new prime ministers. They'll all be very well ready to whack out the briefing document for the new government. The muscle that hasn't been worked so much in recent years is that kind of actually sticking to the medium and long term to one project and delivering on something, all the way through. So leading people through, okay, we're going to keep you motivated, even though actually we're not in an immediate crisis. We haven't got adrenaline. We haven't got the easy priority of this is the crisis, everyone focus on it. Leading through that kind of business, that kind of work, is something I think a little bit different, and something that, people in the civil service can be reflecting on now. And I think we did a piece, a webinar last year, a discussion about resilience and about how to kind of help build that and how to help protect that as civil servants. And one of the points that came up was around, it's really important to be connected to the purpose of your work and the value of your work. And so it is about thinking around, okay, well, why did I become a civil servant? It's about delivering, making a change, delivering through the democratic process, and kind of helping teams to connect to that, to the purpose of their work, to the value of their work, when it's not just an immediate crisis response. I think reflecting on that as a team and as a leader is kind of something that might be helpful to think about in advance of the election.
Great. Thank you, Susanna. I want to talk now a bit about skills, capabilities and a mission-led government. So I'm going to ask you, Jonathan, first. Labour have said that they want to take a longer-term approach. They've talked about a decade of national renewal, and they may well get 2 terms. So what could that mean for ways of working? I suppose that ties into what Susanna was saying about kind of thinking more longer term. And also, what do you think a mission-led approach could mean in government, and what challenges might that lay down to civil servants?
Sure. I can't resist, though, responding just to a couple of the anecdotes. My version on election day in 2010 was, we spent the previous year preparing for the new arrival of the Justice Secretary, who we were confidently anticipating was going to be Dominic Grieve. We'd had about 10 Access Talks meetings with him, and it turned out to be Ken Clarke. You never know what you're going to get until it happens. So the main, message is be ready for the unexpected. Anyway, like Kavian, we were all waiting in the reception. Where the hell is he? Where is he? He's not here. It's not very far from number 10 to the Ministry of Justice. We've forgotten that Ken. So Suma, permanent secretary, says to Darren Tierney, who's now in charge of priority and ethics, but at the time was the principal private secretary, phone him on the mobile. Well, we contact number 10. He hasn't got a mobile. He's Ken Clarke. So we had to send out a team of people to find him. Anyway, it's trivial, but you just who knows what's going to happen. Who knows? So mission-led. There is, of course, Alex's point that a new government that's here for the long term could find out the day after it started that something's on fire. And so, there's a balance between the two things. And as a matter of fact, one would imagine that there will be more crises to deal with in the days and weeks after a new government than normal. I mean, I've not been a civil servant for 4 years, but I would be amazed if the current government hasn't been doing everything within its power to push things that are about to fail to the right until after the date of the next election. I mean, to take my old area of responsibility, education, it must be the case that a number of universities are facing bankruptcy, and that the DfE will be doing everything that they possibly can to make sure the first of those is after the next election. So you end up with all sorts of stuff that needs to be done that a new set of ministers don't know anything about. Anyway, I promise to answer your question. So mission-led means, I think, longer term. So Keir Starmer is saying, he wants to be thinking 10 years. And that's obviously a jolly good thing for civil servants, isn't it? I mean, the current Prime Minister talks about the long term, but it's hard for him to sustain that narrative in the circumstance he finds himself in. And it's certainly not in practice what civil servants, have had much experience in doing. So thinking what that actually means, it requires a really quite serious mindset shift. And there'll be a lot of skepticism about whether, Keir Starmer really means it and so on. And who knows, the events will happen. But I think we should assume that he means it. And people should be spending a lot of time thinking about, well, if you were going to take 10 years or 15 years to do something, rather than before a new Prime Minister gets elected in 12 months' time or 49 days' time, what would that mean? Because it would be quite significantly different. Now, the good news is that the civil service, can do this and has done it. Universal credit is quite an interesting example of that, which we went badly wrong at first, but then we're really quite well. When I talk to my colleagues, some of the things they most enjoyed doing were things that took quite a long time. Sure Start, to take one example that's been in the news recently. So it's not like we can't do it, it's just we haven't been doing it. And so let's learn from people who have done it. The other thing that missions means is outcomes, is working from the point of view of the citizens and the public, not from the perspective of the department. Now, goodness me, we're really bad at that. Again, it has been done. Sure Start is a good example of that too. There are a few, a small number. I remember talking to a guy who's still a civil servant who said that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and Robin Cook and the others, they came in, they were on first name terms, and it took the civil service about a week to get them writing letters to each other. Dear Secretary of State, I'm afraid the answer is no. For them, they were a team of people wanting to do the best for particular groups of people. That's not the way the civil service generally operates, but it is what Keir Starmer wants to do. So, some serious serious shift, medium to long term outcomes rather than inputs. The good news is that is the most satisfying work. I mean, it really is. And the civil service can do it really well. So let's not waste the opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Kavien, I'm going to come to you on missions and skills and capabilities next, and then I think we'll open it up to questions because we've had so many brilliant questions come in. So also, Kavien, I've heard you say that you think the era of 3 to 5 year strategies is probably dead. Could you tell us why you think that and what you mean and what you've observed being a kind of outsider who's brought in to come and support government and what that says about which skills might be lacking?
Yeah, the point on 3 to 5 year strategies being dead is more about the approach that we see civil servants and teams taking to actually developing and then implementing reform and implementing transformation. If I'm going to exaggerate for effect, there was a time where we would sit and write a strategy that forecasts and says in 5 years' time, this is exactly where we're going to be and this is how we're going to deliver it. And then we would unveil that, and that would be pushed out from the centre. And we would assume that the delivery ecosystem is then going to be able to execute against that. I think what we see now is that a much more incremental approach is required, particularly when there's a change of government, because there is a need to be able to demonstrate progress, to be able to deliver incrementally whilst also keeping an eye on the long term. But to your question on missions and what's the implication of taking a mission-based approach, and Jonathan, you've picked up on some of this. I think there are a few key things that we think are kind of the big implications for the civil service. I think, Jonathan, to your point on outcomes, there is definitely something about being clear on the purpose of the transformation or the purpose of the mission and the reform, and what are the outcomes that are intended. Working across policy teams, departmental lines, and actually out into the private sector as well. So take the missions on, getting Britain building again. That is going to require an activation of, the private sector for infrastructure and things like that. Needing to be really clear on the purpose and the outcomes being delivered when you are delivering across multiple teams, multiple departments and multiple sectors is really critical. And to Jonathan and Alex's point on things will change, right? Crises will come along, there will be reshuffles, there will be delivery challenges, and the very small nuances that you see today in, one team thinking the purpose and the outcome is one thing and another team thinking something different. They will be small differences today, but they will be very large differences in 3 to 5 years' time when you are much further down the road on the delivery of that mission. The other point, and Jonathan, you picked up on this, is about citizens and users. Whether it's the missions in health, whether it's the missions in law enforcement, or whether it's the missions around the areas that have less well-defined policy and departmental lines in, social mobility and access to opportunity. There are going to be a very varied and wide set of citizens that are being impacted by the mission. So really understanding what their needs are and how we are going to deliver those needs is critical. Again, to exaggerate for effect, a point policy intervention that is focused on one set of citizens is very, very different to a mission which is covering a system and then also a range of citizens. And then I would say the last thing about the missions is then the amount of creativity that we think is going to be required to find the different ways of approaching their design, their implementation, and their delivery. And some of that will be about the skills and capabilities that the civil servants and the broader kind of teams around them have, so being much more technology literate. But some of that is just about the approach to actually developing the policy and to moving forward. So taking a much more open approach, taking an approach that is much more data-driven and insight-led and open to that challenge from the outset, we think will be really critical to the implementation of missions.
Great. Thank you so much, Kavian. Well, I feel like an hour isn't nearly long enough to talk about everything that we've got to talk about, but I'm going to go into questions. We've had some brilliant ones. Let me find it. There was one about civil service headcount, which is something I was going to ask the panel as well. And the question is, what is the panel's opinion on how a new administration will impact or amend the civil service headcount announcements that departments are currently struggling to deliver under? I might go to you, Alex, on that one first, if that's all right.
Sure. Well, I hope they'll scrap sort of arbitrary headcount targets. We've talked a lot about this, and I think if you want efficiencies, headcount targets are often not the way to go because they create all sorts of perverse incentives and strange things around that. So there are all sorts of ways that you might try and drive efficiencies through the system and do more. but headcount targets I'm pretty sceptical about. So I hope they will get rid of those. What I also hope they'll do is actually take a look at what they want the civil service to be doing and to achieve, and come up with size, shape, and cost to the civil service based on what they actually wanted to do. Again, that is one of those things, I said earlier, easy to say, hard to do. But I do think one of the really damaging things for the capability of the civil service over the last 15, 20, 25 years is this kind of boom and bust. Let's reduce the numbers of the civil service down, and then Brexit and COVID happens, increase the numbers, and so on. And that inevitably leads to a kind of hollowing out of capability. It reinforces some of the stuff that I think is one of the things that the civil service really needs to be on top of, which is dealing with staff churn and the loss of expertise, which should be one of the strengths of the civil service. And I think, who knows, but I think a Labour government has probably got that. They will face different pressures to that of the current Conservative government if they do form a government, and those will be so the whole kind of framing of the debate, I think, will probably feel a little bit different. But I don't think they're about to say, we don't care about inefficiency, we're going to kind of let the civil service find its own level. I think they will still need mechanisms for controlling and managing the civil service workforce, but I hope they do it in a more kind of outcome based and intelligent way than this kind of crude headcount thing that we've seen.
Thanks, Alex. Does anyone want to come in on job cuts? If not, then we can move on to another incredibly contentious topic. I know every time CSW covers it, the traffic on our website goes through the roof. Totally understandable, because it's to do with civil servants, working lives. It's about working from home. So, sorry, let me just find it. Elephant in the room. Do we expect the new administration to, and again, this is all with the disclaimer, somebody just said, are we in danger of sleepwalking into assuming that this is a Labour government? I don't know if that contributed sort of the beginning of the discussion, but we did go through, we issued a lot of disclaimers, and nobody knows what's going to happen, and the polls are wrong, and we talked about coalition governments and hung parliaments and things like that. And then we decided that we would just sort of assume, just for the sake of this hypothetical conversation, that it is a Labour majority. So with that in mind, do we expect a new administration to stop complaining about working from home? Jonathan, I know that the working from home thing probably hadn't quite reached a level of intensity when you were still a permanent secretary, not least because it was law that we all had to work from home, because I think you left during the pandemic. But obviously the rhetoric now has become incredibly toxic around civil servants, and it's something that is really upsetting them. So do we think that a potential Labour government would dial down those attacks?
When I joined the Department for Education in 2016, I was struck by the fact that this was a national organisation which had teams of people based in Coventry and Sheffield, London and Bristol, and teams were split across these various sites, and they weren't going to waste their time travelling all day long. And so the notion of people working in teams using IT as the means by which they communicated with each other was much more normal in DFE in 2016 than I had seen elsewhere. I was really rather impressed. I remember a conversation with a woman I went to see in Darlington. What's your job? I'm the PA to the head of data. What, Neil? He's in Bristol. You're in Darlington. She said, so what? So, that demonstrates that you don't need to be sitting next to somebody to work effectively with them. Equally, my experience of the switch, well, obviously everybody's experience of the switch to the lockdown and everybody working from home, it wasn't planned, right? To put it most straightforwardly. And it's just sort of happened. And I haven't really heard anybody, maybe I've just not been in the right room at the right time, online or otherwise, I've not heard anybody explain what they think is the right mix. I've heard a sort of, argument about whether it's better to be in the office or not. But surely a sort of combination of things is good for us. Which of us is going to argue that there is no benefit in any circumstances of Alex and me being in a room together? Really? That's not how human beings get energy from each other. You can do some stuff when you're in a room with somebody, and some stuff and some different things when you're not. Precisely, Jess, because the debate in recent years has been so sort of depressing. You're not coming into the office enough type nonsense. There's not been a space for a mature conversation. I would have thought, maybe it's just a sign of my age, that people coming into the civil service would want the benefits of both, and the question would be how to get them. A situation in which somebody's forced to come to the office but there's no desk for them and the rest of their team aren't in on that day is obviously completely hopeless. Equally, I don't want DfE civil servants in their own homes when they should be in schools talking to teachers, to take an example, and they can't talk to the teachers online because they're in the classrooms. So what is, if you strip away a sort of absurd ideological debate about it, and that does seem to be a tremendous opportunity presented by the results of the next election. It's not certain. But, there's going to be no money, but there might be a bit less ideology and a bit less culture wars and a bit less, oh, God. What does good look like? And I because, you've got to be ready for that opportunity. What would you like? What would be a really great way of working in the most productive way? Who knows whether Labour politicians or whoever wins the election will give it to you. But if I were being asked what is good, I'm not sure I could describe it at the moment. So, you've got a few months to come up with a plan, or maybe only a few weeks.
Can I just really quickly come in, because I agree with Jonathan completely on the sort of blended mixed economy and work out what works. And it will be, again, I think one of the kind of facile things of this debate is it's seen as a sort of blanket approach to the civil service as a kind of complete thing. And of course, it's different for different people, different for different individuals, it's different for different teams, it's different for the different sort of work that you do. So I do think it needs to be a kind of, it's about good management, isn't it, in the end, which I guess is what Jonathan was saying. But in terms of what a future government might do, there are certain sort of underpinning structural factors that I think we can predict. One is that the Whitehall and the rest of the government estate is not going to suddenly grow, so there aren't going to be loads more desks for people. So flexible working is here to stay one way or another, whatever ministers say. On the other side of that debate, I don't think that certain media organisations' business models are suddenly going to stop relying on people walking through train stations in London and picking up free newspapers. So I would absolutely expect certain kind of lurid campaigns to continue, because it's in the business interests of certain, of certain parts of the media, and it's a very easy kind of Whitehall bashing trope to roll out. But equally, if even under all the pressure that has been applied on that, lots of civil servants are still working flexibly and working from home, I just think there's a kind of reality to that. And so, much like Jonathan, let's take this out of the realm of the kind of public debate and just into what works and what's good management. And I think there's a fair chance that will happen if there is a Labour government, but nothing is guaranteed. Who knows? And certainly, I think ministers are human, and ministers are politicians normally, and so gregarious people who get their energy from being around people. So there will be there will continue to be, I think, a certain desire for those who work most closely with ministers to be, at least mostly physically around those ministers, which is a small part of this, obviously.
Thank you. Actually, Alex, I'm going to stay with you because one of the questions we've had sort of tallies with something that I know you've thought about a bit. So does the panel detect any likely machinery of government changes based on Labour's agenda? And I know, Alex, you said that Labour don't seem to be enormously enthused by big machinery of government changes, but they are interested in changes to the process of government and how to organise government within existing departmental structures. So I was just wondering if you could say a bit about that.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting. I think that's right. I mean, again, as with all of this, who knows? I think there's an extent to which senior Labour figures haven't made up their mind about exactly how they might want to organise things. So let's not, it's a bit like the date of the election, let's not speculate too much when even the principal actors don't know. But I think there's a presumption against too much organisational change, which I think does come from, I saw the question about what Starmer's experience as DPP would mean. I think comes from someone who is familiar, someone at the top of the Labour Party who is familiar with the disruption that big organisational change causes. I mean, we've thought about it a lot from the IFG's perspective because we've just finished this big project on the centre of government, and so have made certain, pretty radical recommendations about the Cabinet Office and the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet and so on. So we think there are cases where machinery of government changes are justified while recognising the disruption. I hope Labour are interested in those, but exactly how they translate those, I suspect, will be less in the showy machinery of government changes and more under the bonnet, as you were suggesting, Jess. I think on the process of government stuff, I'm conscious of time, so I'll be quick, but there is a big question which links to what we were all saying earlier around missions, which is how missions will actually be translated into government. I think there are some really interesting questions about the mixing of the ideas that will come from the civil service about how to use cabinet committees and task forces or ministerial groups or anything else, and how those could be applied to what are really quite different missions. Some of them are conducive to a sort of neat cabinet committee, others really aren't. The other thing I'll be looking out for is accounting officers and whether mission-driven, mission-led government actually changes some of the kind of underpinning wiring in departments about accounting officers, and whether Labour, as they come in, have ideas for resolving some of those kind of internal tensions that inhibit cross-departmental working that most people on this call will be familiar with. But if you don't look at how the money flows, then I suspect those people pushing mission government will always be kind of swimming against the tide.
Jess, if I could just to very, very quickly, and I'm conscious of time, I think there's a real opportunity in the missions and in not necessarily kind of reflexively falling to there has to be a machinery of government change, because actually that bakes in a lack of flexibility as things change. You don't want to have to go through that disruption every time. But thinking about how the civil service decides to organise itself around these missions, in bringing together the policy, in bringing together delivery, in bringing together a lot of the enabling things that need to be in place around the digital expertise, the technology expertise. I talked earlier about the insight from users. There is a real opportunity here to think about that process of government. It's equally about the accounting officers and accountability at the front end and how we get information through to ministers, but it's also about how the teams of civil servants and broader out into the delivery networks. If you're in DFE, it's not just the DFE civil servants that need to be brought into the conversation. It's actually much broader than that, out into schools, and you could do that in any sector. How do we start to coalesce and structure ourselves around these missions and work in potentially a quite radically different way compared to how we have done things in the past, where it's quite linear in how we go from policy through to strategy, through to delivery and implementation. So I think there's real opportunity in there. And in fact, not moving to machinery of government changes kind of enables that. We just need to think quite creatively about it.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I can't believe we've only got 1 minute left of the conversation. It's flown by. I'm going to ask each panelist to just offer some closing thoughts, either what the thing you found most interesting from the conversation or what you think that our audience's key takeaway could be from the conversation. I know Alex has a hard stop at 11:30. So Alex, I will go to you first and then I'll go round the virtual room.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. Well, I will be brief. I think there are 2 quick points. One is we talked a lot earlier about the excitement and the energy that comes from a potential change of government. I think that's absolutely true. But I think civil servants should also strap in for a period of inactivity as well, because if you don't happen to be, and no harm in that, in the area that an incoming minister alights on straight away, the system actually can take quite a long time to get into gear, to sort of clear all the lines to take that you need in order to do the PQs and the correspondence, and to get the kind of the policy programs moving again, and so on. So don't be surprised if in the short term you find things a little bit understimulating, even in the immediate aftermath of an election, because it will take a while for things to settle out. And then the final thought for me is a broader one, which is, again, if it's a Labour government, I think we will all be surprised by just how much the sort of debates, working from home is a good one, change. Suddenly the framing of policy debates will be about what's going on inside the Labour Party if it's a government with a solid majority, and so we have been very used over the last number of years to being sort of, if you follow this stuff, to highly attuned to what's going on inside the Conservative Party. The sorts of debates inside the Labour Party and that divide the Labour Party will be quite different. It will be about centralising and devolution. It will be about targets or kind of bottom-up stuff. So I think keeping an open mind to how those debates pan out and expecting it to feel quite different is something that is good to have in the back of your mind as we go through the next phase.
Sorry, just trying to find the unmute button. Thank you so much, Alex. We will let you go, but that was fascinating. Thanks for all your contributions. Jonathan, I'm going to come to you next. Any closing thoughts?
So, as you already heard, Ken Clarke was my new Secretary of State in 2010. We felt incredibly lucky working for a very experienced Secretary of State who was also very witty. I never had a meeting with him in which I didn't laugh. And, that is pretty good. That makes a big difference if you're enjoying yourself. And I think it was Alex, but it was somebody. I said, God, we were so lucky. And that whoever it was said to me, well, you make your own luck. We had spent quite a lot of time preparing we didn't know what it was going to be. We weren't expecting to be Ken, but he thought a lot about the opportunity presented by a new government with a mandate for change. So, my message is don't waste the opportunity. Who knows? It's not going to be easy. They haven't got any money. There are all sorts of crises, of course, but there is a decent chance for a government that's going to be in place for quite a long time, headed by a human rights lawyer who knows what it's like to be a civil servant. And it's entirely possible one moves away from sort of mad headcount targets, arguments about diversity being like a bad thing or something, and a more mature way of doing business. Who knows whether that's going to happen, but it'd be a real mistake, wouldn't it, if the opportunity arises to work in that way and the civil service is not ready. And I've worked for almost no ministers in my 20 years who were frustrated when civil servants told them what they thought. It was almost always the case that civil servants would say to me in the Department of Education, are you sure Nick Gibb wants to hear my advice about what I think is going to work? And they'd only just started in the department. They'd certainly never met him. Please go into your time with new ministers saying what you think. Say so with respect, say so thoughtfully, but please say what you think. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That's great. Kavien, I haven't forgotten about you, Susanna. Kavien, I'm going to come to you next just for your kind of closing thoughts.
I'll keep it very brief and wholeheartedly endorse Jonathan's point there. And I would just reinforce it to say use that opportunity to think about how we can do things a bit differently. I talked a bit a moment ago about how we go from policy into implementation and how we do that over that mission approach in that period of time. There is an opportunity to think about how we, in the civil service, in the broader public sector, and in partners who support them, how do we do this a bit differently so that we can deliver the intended outcomes?
Thank you. Suze, final thoughts?
So we should have ended with Jonathan, really. He's much more inspiring than I'm going to be, because I think one thing I've picked up in this discussion and previous ones is, it is an exciting moment, a point of potential change, a point where we could do things differently. But some of the challenges, many of the challenges that just management challenges of a large organisation and the civil service related challenges will still remain. So if you think of working from home, yes, the political heat might be taken out of it, but there's still some management heat, and you may have people in your team who don't want to come in as much as you want them to come in, even though that that's the right balance for your organisation, or the property problems or not enough desks, all those kind of things. Those day-to-day management problems remain, even if the political atmosphere lightens. And I would say also it's an opportunity, if it's going to be a bit more inspiring, yes, think about how we achieve outcomes differently, but there's also a lot of things that we could change about the way the civil service runs itself, manages itself, looks after its people. We've committed, or civil service has committed to a pay reform review, which I think was them kind of kicking the ball in, giving themselves time to think of some clever ideas about how do we finally unknot some of these problems around pay. Well, let's think about that now, and then have some really good options to present to ministers, so that civil service reform, never a sexy, not going to be in a manifesto, it's not going to be like a vote winner, but it's really important. And if you've got new people coming in, as Jonathan says, with experience and understanding about public service reform and public service management, let's be sure to give them a really good table of options to think about, so that they can drive those changes through as well.
Great, thank you so much. Just to remind everybody that there will be an on-demand version of this webinar available on the CSW website. So look out for that. And we will also try and follow up with some responses to some of the brilliant questions that we haven't been able to get to today. So all that's left for me to say is thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to everyone who tuned in, and goodbye for now.
Bye.